A lot has been said about Russian involvement, especially the role of mercenaries in Africa.
To access are enabled, for example, by illicit organized crime. It's not merely about accessing the natural resources, it's not merely about having influence on the ground, not just another network operating in Sudan. They are enablers of the war. Was exactly the same amount of time on TV or on newspapers as Bucha or Mariupol did, or as Gaza did. Probably this would not only get more traction, but it would also prompt, for example, more sanctions.
Welcome, everyone, to Spotlight Africa, the Osavul podcast on how information, influence, and perception shape conflict in Africa. For this episode, we're continuing to shine the spotlight on Sudan. The brutal civil war is the largest war most people haven't heard of. I mean, this week alone, news outlets have reported evidence of systematic killings in the Sudanese city of El Fasher, which has prompted human rights and aid activists to describe the civil war between the paramilitary rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces as a continuation of the Darfur genocide. To help us unpack this devastating conflict, the foreign actors involved, the economic drivers, and why it's not getting the international attention it deserves, we're joined today by Dr. Joana De Deus Pereira. Dr. Pereira is a senior research fellow at RUSI Europe, where she specializes in conflict and geopolitical analysis in sub-Saharan Africa. Her work is particularly relevant in today's topic, as her research, including her PhD from War Studies Department at King's College London, has focused specifically on the privatization of security and the role of private actors in African conflicts. Joanna, thank you so much for joining us again, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for the invitation. It's happy to be here.
All right, let's get straight into it. So, a lot has been said about Russian involvement, especially the role of mercenaries in Africa. What can you tell us? What do we know about the Wagner Group and its involvement in Africa, and tell us a little bit about how it's rebranded into the Africa Corps?
It's not old news. It's actually, as you said, a question that has been connected to relabeling, reconfiguration as well. And Wagner has been present in Africa for more than 5 years now. It has been rebranded recently after Prigozhin's death, and came to the spotlight as clearly linked to the Russian government after Lavrov announcement that the Russian government was actually backing financially Wagner operations. And since then, this rebranding has been operating in Africa. I should say, though, that in some countries they still refer to Africa Corps as Wagner. This happens very frequently in Central Africa Republic, but also in Mali and Sudan. What this tells us is that it's way more difficult to for the international community to eliminate organizations or to declare the elimination or the death of organizations like Wagner, because we have assisted many times to this phenomenon of shape-shifting, of relabeling and renaming. So the story is quite a dense one that it's different from country to country. The presence in Africa of Wagner and now Africa Corps, it's not a monolith, and it has been. I would say that the repeating pattern, it has been always linked to operations that are financed by the extraction of natural resources.
Indeed, and we're going to touch on that and how that links to the war in Sudan. But you've been a pioneer in this research. You've been following, the Wagner Group and mercenaries, in Africa. How has, from your perspective, how have things changed from maybe when they were less known to, today? I mean, you mentioned Prigozhin, and a lot of it's maybe had a bit more media attention. People are a little bit more aware. But how has this kind of evolution? How have things changed, and on the operational level, have things changed, or have things started to change under new leadership, new name, new branding?
I think the thing that changed the most was the threat to the plausible deniability. So until the very moment, even before Prigozhin came forward and said, "I am Prigozhin, I'm the leader of Wagner," everything that you cannot see, that you cannot deem as accountable, will remain under the guise of the plausible deniability. So what changed, in fact, was when you pass from the moment of everything was actually in the shadows, in a very gray area, and then you have a public official basically assuming that they are financially backing the operations of this paramilitary organization. You, on one hand, have the possibility of giving responsibility and make accountable those that are behind it and that are facing the organization. And this also means, obviously, the possibility of having sanctions, the possibility of having assets frozen. But at operational level, I would say that very little things change. If you look, for example, at what's happening in Central Africa Republic, and where you have Wagner, aka Africa Corps, operationals doing the private security of President Touadera, and that are that have a very organic and embedded relationship with the government. We basically can say that pretty nothing has changed in terms of operations. I would say that the fact that we now know, and again, that was publicly said by the government of Russia, that they were financially supporting Wagner operations and then Africa Corps, that you have more possibility to make those organizations accountable. But in fact, underreporting, and I think we will now jump to the case of Sudan, has not made this possible, or at least has made this very weak in terms of responsibilization of those who are actually behind it.
And I think accountability is probably that key word, because essentially what you have is a proxy paramilitary group that can help with logistics, air support, weapons, resources. Pretty much it can do favors. It can do favors to, governments in Africa on behalf of the Russian state, but under the radar of being a state actor. And I guess it then fits into this gray zone, when you look at accountability, when you look at kind of international law and international institutions, probably more difficult to put sanctions on an organization such as this. So very, very useful and handy.
It's true. So the proxy relationship, and as a matter of for our audience to, if they are interested in this area, to look at the latest report published by the UN Working Group on Mercenaries on proxies, really sheds light on this relationship that is an invisible hand from afar, that basically enables all these operations to continue to endure without having a, a causation proof that then can be on a later stage used for prosecution, for example, or for victims' reparation, which is, in this case, I think, the most concerning point of the impact of this operation. So we know that mercenary related activities, paramilitary groups are perpetrating mass atrocities in Africa, but also in other areas of the globe. And then what's left behind, it's actually the things that we cannot immediately see. And I believe we will also talk today about how the Sudanese war, it's also almost unseen war, or at least not as reported as other wars going on at the moment. And the victim side, it's constantly neglected when looking at the impact of the operations of mercenaries and mercenary related actors.
Yeah, I saw some shocking images from earlier this week, which are just truly, yeah, terrible to see. But I just want to go back on, I'm thinking how these mercenaries operate. They must get paid, but how well do they get paid, and at what point do they start maybe doing things for themselves? How do they? And maybe this links down to the gold in Sudan, but at what point do they start? Kind of acting independently, looting and getting involved in lucrative kind of sales, and maybe that does kind of link into kind of natural resources.
Yes, I would say that in Africa, the typology of operations is, for example, quite different than the ones going on, for example, in Ukraine, where a clear structure of command is or was in place. In Africa, for several reasons, and again, we we tend as Western academics and researchers to look at Africa as just one thing, and we are talking about completely different countries, completely different modes of operation. But there is a certain degree of autonomy and kind of the possibility to operate in bubbles of power. This is actually what has enabled groups such as Wagner and now Africa Corps to continue to operate, because the power is less pyramidal structure than as in normal structures, and basically you have bubbles of power that, in the eventuality of an attack or a specific target, the other bubbles continue to operate. So yes, in that sense, they have a certain degree of autonomy. And then you also have the link to the extraction of natural resources. And when we look at the extraction of natural resources and the combination with mercenaries and mercenary related activities, we also have a third layer, which is how these two axes are enabled, for example, by illicit organized crime. We have, in the case of Sudan, but also of CAR, illicit organized crime flows, in the case of Sudan, related to gold, related to the extraction, but also related to the transport, and then related to the laundering of the profits of the gold itself. But you had exactly the same modus operandi in Libya, and also in Central Africa Republic as well. So I would say it's a kind of ecosystem. This is not just about the mercenaries or the mercenary related activities. It's about how, and looking this from the proxy lens, how it has been leveraged, maximized by afar, or all the fractures that were already existent in the countries that I named. So it was not
They're
something that
exploiting these countries.
exactly.
Yeah.
It was not. It's not something that was created by these groups. Well,
Mm.
the fractures, the fragilities were already there. Obviously, some of them were weaponized, and some of them were um, actually maximized with the operations of these groups.
And that kind of segues into my next question, because when I think of Russia's strategy in Africa, and as you just said, Africa is really, it's complex and full of many different countries and everything. But you do think of it's opportunistic. I think when I think of it, I see there are kind of old school, no, sorry, not old school, but traditional kind of geostrategic elements. Maybe a foothold into the Mediterranean, influence in the Strait of Hormuz, some minerals, yeah, gold, but it's also to gain influence. To kind of destabilize the West,
Yes.
and it's very much in that destabilization. So, at what point, how do you think the role of Africa Corps, of the Wagner Group, fits into the wider strategy in Africa itself? Because you've mentioned Central African Republic, Mali, Libya. So yeah, how do you see it fitting into the broader strategy?
Well, this is part of the bigger game, and I believe that we have touched upon this on our previous podcast. It's not merely about accessing the natural resources. It's not merely about having influence on the ground. So the bigger strategy, and talking specifically about Russia, but we could also be talking about Turkey or China, but looking specifically at Russia, it has to do also with the politics that Russia is willing to operate in Africa, not only to destabilize the relationship between the West, specifically the countries of the West that were former colonizers in relation to their former colonies, but also to really reassert Russia position outside their borders. So this is part of a wider politics of engagement that you can see through the speeches in every Africa Russia summit, where you have political leaders from both sides addressing to each other as partners. And it's very important to underline something that I think sometimes it's quite disregarded, which is these countries, the African countries, they have their own agency, they have their own capacity to decide. Of course, we can be talking about new forms of colonization, but in fact, you have these countries engaging diplomatically, aligning in a very open and public way with Russia. This is not officially interference from Russia in the states. You have clear diplomatic engagement between Russia and several different African states. So this is the big difference, I believe, from the early the 20th century relationship between colonizing countries and the colonized countries in Africa, and the relationship that Russia wants to
Mm.
have with these countries as well. So this is a huge difference. And I think we should be extremely careful, because in terms of the politics and in terms of how we will design future policy and political engagement with Africa, we'll have to consider that these countries have their own agency, their own capacity to decide who they want to engage with.
Mm. Well, I think we've probably brought the listeners up to speed on the Africa Corps and Wagner, in Africa. If we look at kind of what's going on in Sudan, do they have a side? Are the Africa Corps, working with one faction? Is it the RSF or?
Well, this is, I think, well, of course, they shift sides. They are not just another network operating in Sudan. They are enablers of the war in a certain in a certain sense. They have been also the lifeline for the operations of both sides. So you have, on one hand, Africa Corps and previously Wagner supporting RSF, but you also have on the other side Russia really engaging in negotiations for Port of Sudan as well. So basically, you have here kind of trampoline leveraging because it's about gaining. It doesn't matter
Just a
who
nice
you are
filler.
supporting. Yes, exactly. It's about cherry picking precise moments first to continue to enable destabilization. Every time you have destabilization and fragmentation, you create gaps. Whenever you create gaps, you also create opportunities to intervene. So it is an opportunistic relationship
But
that
it's
we
also
see.
calculated. So it's like
Yes,
calculated but
of
opportunistic
course,
at the same time. Yeah.
it's calculated, and it has to do also with the capacity that Russia and their proxy tools have been using in terms of foreseeability and contributing to something that they have already identified in their horizon scanning as something that can be highly profitable for them, either on one side or the other. Because if you look at the crisis in Sudan, it's not only about the massacre and the atrocities. This is not about Khartoum versus Darfur. This is about also the spillovers that this war is already creating. So it's about the mass migratory flows to neighboring countries. It's in consequence, and talking about migration flows, about how this will put pressure on Libya and the Mediterranean routes to
Mm.
Europe, and how this is a destabilizing factor, a highly destabilizing factor to Europe, for example. But it's also about the capacity to be a destabilizer, for example, through escalation. What they have been supporting and the permissive environment that they have been creating is nothing less than kind of a secure zone where no external force has the power to really interrupt. So
Mm.
we can even say, and what really appalls me in the case of Sudan is that we are really looking at a copy paste, more or less, pattern of what has happened in CAR and in Mali. You have the same torture, the same summary executions, the same disappearances. We know that this pattern from advance. And it's important to note here that obviously the crime scene is Sudanese, but the crime enabling system is absolutely transnational
Mm.
here.
Mm.
So this is where it becomes so difficult to tackle, and this is why mercenary and mercenary related activities in scenarios like Sudan, CAR, or Mali are so difficult and complex to address.
Mm. And I mean, look, conflict in Sudan has been on and off prolonging for
Yeah.
decades. For our listeners, you had the separationist war, Sudan and South Sudan, and that was very much, you had ethical difference, sorry, ethical ethnicity differences between the North and the South, and there was oil played quite a big role, and like you just said, now this, we've talked about gold, but this isn't just a civil war between the SAF and the RSF. This is a proxy war. This is there are serious implications for the region and for the Horn of Africa, but also for parts of the Middle East and the trade that goes through that area. And you've touched on and the kind of humanitarian and immigration aspect. So yeah, what do you think? How do you see this playing out? And maybe we can also touch on the UAE a little bit here and their role.
Well, yes, this is important because this is not only about Russia. This is also about other foreign actors that basically are enabling this, because we can obviously argue that, okay, Africa Corps, Wagner, they have been protecting, for example, the extraction sites and have been having the oversight of the gold transit flows. But then, and this has been widely reported by the UN, so it's not me saying, it's the specialists saying that there are clear signs of having UAE, the Emirati, involved in this. And this is where it gets interesting from the point of view of analysis, because gold itself, we are talking about gold. Gold is, if you look at it, it's offshore. It's also multi-purpose, and on the other hand, it makes proxy war way cheaper. And then gold itself, not only the activities, it's also, I would say, an excellent vehicle for plausible deniability. Once you put the gold in the market, it vanishes. The traceability of the gold, it's absolutely gone. So here, it's not only about those who are actually there protecting the extraction, protecting the flows, the transit, but are also the ones that participate actively in the marketization of the gold, and then on the reinjection of this money that loses all its original track. And
maybe they'll end up in the Louvre. No, I'm just joking. That's just a bit of comic relief.
Of course, but this is also linked to something that a lot of people ask me: why aren't we listening about Sudan as much as we hear about Gaza or about Ukraine? And I think one of the reasons is precisely because there is still a lot of reluctance from key country leaders to really assume and come forward and say, well, it looks like there are third countries involved in this war that are also fueling the economy of war, the economy of the massacres, and the economy of the atrocities. And if you look at the diplomatic movements, they have been extremely cautious. Obviously, I do understand why. I think it will be extremely difficult to have any key political leader basically waving the flag, announcing there is a Gulf country that is basically an RSF supplier, even though you have UN allegations that claim this information to be credible. So again, because we are talking about accountability and deniability, the things that you cannot see, the things that are not palpable, are very, very difficult to materialize. And this works for diplomacy. This works for media coverage. This works for the dynamics of geopolitics as we see it. It's what I call geopolitical denialism. It is what is happening in Sudan. It's geopolitical denialism.
I think that's the soundbite right there. And I want to segue into the media problem, because this is really the crux of this podcast focus. We like to see things from the lens of information warfare, strategic communications, media, whatever you want to call it. But just on that, you talked about, I think it's been called the Quad, or there are these players involved in the peace. They're trying to end the conflict, but some of them are involved in fueling the conflict. So it seems very peculiar. It seems like maybe compared to a decade ago, institutions like the African Union or the UN are playing a much kind of reduced role. And it's more about regional powers. It's more about the regional powers involved trying to,
Yeah.
find peace, rather than, kind of international institutions and bodies. It seems like a much more diluted role for them.
Yes, but then you have events as what happened in Al Fashir. So you have
Mm.
facts, and the facts are, for more than 500 days, that city was kept under control. And what happened to Al Fashir was not only the fall of a city; it was something completely different. It What fell, I think, what really, really happened, and what we are now witnessing is that we can no longer say that, or we can no longer say that Sudan is merely regionally contained. We are now at the crucial point that, as international community, we really need to assume that this conflict is of transnational nature. This is no longer a regional conflict. This is no longer a Khartoum versus Darfur. This is no longer an African Union problem, because you have other foreign forces that are actively interfering and actively injecting from one side or the other, unbalancing the conflict from one side or the other. So it's not that nothing is happening in Sudan. Obviously, probably Sudan, it's now the most difficult place to access for journalists, and even to access information, like
Right.
similar to what's going in
Yeah.
Haiti, for example, which is
Yeah.
another hotspot that we can talk on another occasion.
Mm.
But the fact is, Al Fashir, for example, was completely sealed for 18 months. So all the
Mm.
information that was available was either by satellite or by
Right.
or conveyed by, like, super brave journalists on the ground. But
So that
his
kind of that
Yeah,
that goes into this whole media vacuum
yeah,
problem,
yeah.
because those are that's my question. Is it, surely it's not just kind of media war fatigue. It might be that it's just very remote and difficult to get reporters, on the ground there. We feel, it feels like there's 24/7 coverage on other conflicts going on, and this one really just hasn't got the attention it deserves.
Yes, and then you have the hypocrisy of the moment. So every time, every day, every hour, you don't have a journalist or a camera on the ground. For example, RSF gains, and even though it was announced that there will be an investigation like the one promised by Emeti, I think the international community knows that this will be completely empty promises. But then you also have, so you have here RSF gaining without the focus, the media focus, but you also have external suppliers gaining without with the lack of media focus as well. I think we would both agree if the crisis in Sudan was exactly the same amount of time on TV or on newspapers as Bucha or Mariupol did, or as Gaza did, probably this would not only get more traction, but it would also prompt, for example, more sanctions. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about geopolitical denialism, because then you have here a third layer, which is the gold traders. And the gold traders are not only the ones that are in Sudan, but above all are the ones that are outside of Sudan, and that the ones that are dealing and putting the gold in the market and washing the origin of the gold, because this is blood gold. We had blood diamonds before, and this is exactly the same thing. This is blood gold that is being put in the market. So you have Darfur massacre, and then you have a refinery or a washing site that sits outside the region. This is important to know. Again, this is not a regional conflict only. That sits way outside the region, that is enabling the economy and the machinery and the machinery to work. And then you even have another element that we have not mentioned before. So we have talked about Africa Corps, we have talked about Wagner, we have talked about paramilitary forces, which RSF are at the moment. But we also have the transnational element that has been brought by the Colombian mercenaries, for example, which have been accused not only of atrocities, but, for example, of training children's soldiers, which itself is already a crime under international law. So it's more complex than just a regional chronic disease or a regional chronic conflict. It's much, much more and much more complex than that.
It sure is. I mean, the more you kind of discuss it, the more you realize how complex it is. And, you
Yes.
know, for the listener out there that thinks of, Sudan, you probably have an image in your mind. You're also probably not thinking that now drone warfare has actually entered the picture, and that, whether it's an oil depot or critical infrastructure
Yeah.
or a port.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, like we said earlier, there's both kind of calculation and opportunism, and there's also kind of your kind of paramilitary, but there's also kind of sophisticated technology involved in this.
Yes, but well, of course, but that has also to do with the evolution of
Mm.
warfare itself, and also with the economy of war and how cheap it has become to promote and support a drone
You say
warfare.
sophisticated, but as you say, yeah, it's getting more and more affordable
Yes,
to
it's getting more.
make these.
It's
Yeah.
it's 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 more and more affordable. I think we will not have time to touch upon this today, but
No.
this also links to the industry of drone production
Mm.
itself, and how it has been much booming over the last 2 years. Um, and this is happening not only in Africa but in other parts of the world. And you just look at what is happening in Ukraine and Russia as well. But this has been like facilitating quite a lot, not only in terms of operational and attack and defense mechanisms in Sudan, but let's not also forget that, for example, information acquired by drones will be in the future used not only for the war itself, the action defense systems, but it will also be used to control borders, to calculate
Right.
migration
The
flows.
data
So this
collection.
is the
Yeah.
parallel side linked to the drone industry right now, which is also a matter of concern.
Mm.
If we look at through the human rights abuses and the control of information as well. But I think I lost your question.
No.
Oh, that's no, it's okay.
I'll go back to kind of the media landscape. I don't
Yeah.
know if you've followed anything about how either faction are kind of, is there kind of levels. I mean, there's always levels of propaganda. How do they kind of recruit? How do they kind of position themselves? Because all kind of groups need to kind of have some sort of kind of legitimacy, or they need to be able to recruit. So have you seen anything with regards to like the way that they're using media or media technology or communications?
Well, strategic communications has also been one of the, I believe, one of the elements in warfare that has evolved at a super rapid space. So it's not only about the operational ground, it's also about how you echo this for your supporters, but also for the international community, and also to your enemy and to the population. I think, and I've been following what has been out in the Anglophone press, but also on the Francophone press,
Mm.
which varies a lot, and we can see a completely different way of framing. But then looking at the informational battlefield as well, it's also recognizable, for example, that another layer of the proxy war is precisely how information, for example, is channeled through the means that, for example, are controlled by Russia or that are affiliated with Russia. So I believe that the machinery for both factions has been, I would say, operating quite well. Obviously, there is always a tendency to look at these environments as binary or 0 and 1,
Mm.
but they are not homogeneous. It's incredibly difficult to support one side or the other. But I would say that undoubtedly both sides have been trying to use as much as possible the strategic communication tools on their behalf. Yes.
Yeah, and we've covered quite a bit so far, but we've covered a lot actually. Any kind of final remarks, anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to discuss before we wrap up?
I think there is one element for the future
Mm.
that that the international community and also those that in the future will eventually have a say in the peace process. Everything that we've touched upon, and I think also we have been contributing or trying to contribute to this to break this idea that this is not a regional conflict at all, but looking at drones and fighters and cargo planes as well, we are looking at cross-border militarization. So it's important to look besides Khartoum and Darfur and to look at the neighboring countries and how this is really stressing and pressuring neighboring countries. It's important to look at the fragility of Chad and how the conflict in Sudan is really also pressuring Chad, but also Ethiopia, that really needs a stable Red Sea neighborhood as well. But the same goes for Somalia as well. I would like to end with something that obviously concerns me, not only as a researcher, but also as someone that is linked to the research on mercenaries, which is the norm erosion, and also links to your question on the role of African Union, for example, as well. So the fact that we are really seeing mercenary related activities on the ground that are perpetrating mass atrocities, that are contributing to child training, child soldier training. This tells us that Sudan, and when I talk about Sudan, I look at 20 years ago, 2003 and 2005, and the moments we are experiencing now. And Sudan's agony, it's not only a humanitarian failure. I think it's a case study for the consequences of unregulated private force use, for example, the consequences of illicit finance. And I would just like to end that Sudan war is not really just a Sudanese war, and living it underreported, under researched, it will only contribute to international security, instability and insecurity. So this is really what I wanted to reflect upon, that this has gone way beyond the regional space in Africa.
It's sobering, but it's a powerful way to wrap things up. Well, we've kind of looked at foreign mercenaries. We've discussed the role of natural resources and gold, and also the kind of regional players in this conflict, but also the media element, and really that's what Spotlight Africa podcast is about. So I just want to say, Joanna, thank you so much again for
Thank you.
joining us on this Friday evening, and for bringing your expertise and for helping to shine a light on this issue for us.
Thank you so much. Bye.
And to our listeners, if you found this episode important and interesting, which we hope you do, you can find more information on our website or on our social. You can also follow Dr. Pereira's work on RUSI Europe on their website. I'm Surin Murray. I'm the host of Spotlight Africa, and that's it for now. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.